Welcome everyone to Studio One and for our final conversation in the series, and it's when human and machines collaborate. Tonight's conversation will be streamed live, so we do ask that if you have some questions, and I'm sure you'll have some juicy ones by the end, please do wait till we prompt you, and we'll come around with some microphones so the people watching at home can listen in as well. Our host for this evening is Artistic Director and Co-CEO of the Emerging Writers Festival and a Melbourne producer, writer, editor and broadcaster. Will you please join me in thanking Izzy Roberts-Orr?
G'day. To begin, I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting here tonight on Wurundjeri and Bunurong lands of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the first storytellers and traditional owners of this land, to their elders past and present, and to any other elders here tonight. We acknowledge that the land we meet on remembers the stories passed from palm to palm through thousands of generations. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. We acknowledge that our histories interweave. I'm Izzy Roberts-Orr, as has just been said. Thank you for that kind introduction. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you here tonight to this event that we've curated in collaboration with ACMI's conversation series, When Humans and Machines Collaborate. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that title, and we will get there. But I will remind you as well, we are going to have some questions a little bit later tonight, so hold on to those, and we'll have a mic that'll go around so you can ask them a little later. And this event also marks the opening of our Digital Writers Festival, which is an online festival exploring the future of storytelling that's happening right now until this Saturday, the 3rd of November. Where, you ask? The internet. So this is the only real-world event that we have as part of the festival, and you can find everything else, well, including this live stream, through digitalwritersfestival.com or along the hashtag DWF18. Strange, I know, but give it a go. It's really good fun. So, machines are learning to write, compose, paint, and perform all manner of artistic endeavours. But is it art? There's no doubt that machines can create beautiful things, but can we ascribe creativity, an intrinsically human quality, to its processes and productions? Well, tonight we'll discuss just that. And in the spirit of the digital age, we are streaming, and I'd also like to thank our Auslan-interpreters, David and Glenda, for being here tonight. So, to my far left, your far right, we have Alyssa Andrasek, who is a designer and innovator working in the convergence of design, computer science, and exponential technologies, which is just as wild as it sounds. She's bringing AI and robotics to the forefront of architectural design and construction. The founder of BioThing, an award-winning design laboratory, a partner of Bloom Games, and co-founder of AI Build, Andrasek is Professor of Design Innovation at RMIT, prior to which she directed an award-winning program in advanced architectural design at UCL in London and Wonderlab Research. Her work has been exhibited at the Centre Pompidou, Paris, my really good French accent there, New Museum, New York, Storefront, New York, Frac Collection, Orleans, TBA21, Vienna, Beijing and Sydney Biennial, among others. Please make her very welcome. Now, I believe Alyssa's going to show us some of her work. We're going to move through each of the speakers with this brief introduction, and then we'll see some of their work.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. It seems that artificial intelligence is becoming a very hot topic last year. And if I can just get my content on the screen, please. Because maybe it's easier to talk over, yes, over something more visual. So in the past 20 years, I've been working with different forms of media that I always consider being very collaborative, and only in maybe last 3 or 4 years we see explosion of artificial intelligence, which is something that scientists have been working on for over 40 years now, but only with increased computational volumes we can access suddenly this revolution in AI. And sometimes I even find the name artificial intelligence a bit of a misnomer, because It relates to roots of artificial intelligence, which is somehow the idea that this new kind of cognition should be mimicking humans. So it's a very anthropocentric idea. While working in design processes with the generative algorithms, for instance, one always dives into something that you don't know where you will end, because it's always unexpected. So in a way, you are collaborating, you are searching through it. And I will just, in order to introduce certain mood, I will show you a few images that are generated and that I would never be able to generate just by drawing by hand. And also, it was never possible before in history because we didn't have computation. And also, just a quick quote maybe from Denis Hassabis, who is a founder of DeepMind, Google's DeepMind, that is talking about superhuman intuition rather than superhuman calculation when we cross certain threshold of data and information. So suddenly we have machines winning in the, for instance, game of Go or other sort of gaming environments and playing games that are inherently intuitive better than humans. And also, it's not only, because I like to talk about distributed agency, it's not only artificial intelligence that we are talking about other things. So for instance, in this example, working with computational physics, so physics also as agency in terms of my work, creating certain design outcomes. Architects work with slow resistance of matter, but it's also in this case, and I don't have time to go into what's going on in these images, but in this case, computational physics of fluid dynamics, so something like liquids moving through, like a river flowing through a landscape, were used to calculate or to find to derive a certain urban condition in Osaka in Japan, so 1 kilometer of very dense urban condition. So again, this is not something that I could just draw. It's a collaborative, deeply collaborative process. And philosophers talk about that a lot, of this kind of different types of agency and maybe rendering invisible visible. So now we can actually, even forces of physics, we can visualize them, which was not possible before. So suddenly the building or the urban situation emerges into feeding big data into it and using a particular type of physics. Or, for instance, the same type of physics splashed against the body create a piece of furniture. I won't go into, again, the details, but and printed by robots. So one layers of abstraction to another, but this is a kind of impossible liquids that were simulated through certain physics that can't even exist on this planet, but we can now virtually simulate them and harness that data in order to hug the body and then deploy the robot to materialize it. Working with noise, something that we find in, for instance, formations of the clouds and lots of natural phenomena as organizational patterns for complex building fabrics, complex building skins that can face the weather, because weather is also not linear. So again, for the first time in history, we can build or we can design and build with building blocks that are the scale of specks of dust. We can now construct 10,000 times or more precise structures. So then what design could be? So I often think about this idea of automation and alien cognition, and the more we enrich these design processes and aesthetic processes with more and more data, so they can actually talk to things outside of itself. They are not just my individual sketch that then I try to build out there in the world, but they talk to other things through that layer of abstraction, which tonight we will be discussing through different filters. So it's becoming harder and harder for human cognition to search through that sort of, it's almost like diving into, and since I moved last year to Australia, I started diving, so it's a very interesting metaphor. So diving into the ocean of possibilities and trying to really find this incredible creatures. So recently we are also working on somehow developing almost like a design assistant, so that would pick up on certain biases of a designer and sensibility, you could say, and help it choose within a sea of data certain results. and then maybe in the future also surprise us again with something that is unseen, that we could never even imagine before. And I like to work with the concept of alien within familiar, which my new friend here I think will be talking also about in terms of text and theater. And I think this idea of sometimes infusing certain material processes or environments with, for instance, in my case, in the case of my work, higher resolution. I've been accused of being the highest resolution architect in the world because it's a kind of the resolution at which we can now design and also build, as I said, is tens of thousands times larger. So probably I will just, I think I have 5 minutes, so I should probably stop soon. I just wanted to give you some images to somehow develop an imagination of a certain aesthetics also that are coming out of this. And for instance, the last few images, these were algorithms for cellular division, this one as well, which is, for instance, how our bodies grow. So biological cells split and we get a body of a giraffe or my body or a chihuahua. And we also get cancer cells that are actually, unfortunately, smarter than a normal cells. So incredibly smart algorithm now able to be used also in the body of a building. So suddenly something like your bones that are very, very intricate if you look at them under the microscope, because in nature information is free, but material is expensive. So how can we build buildings that are much less heavy, for instance? All the buildings that we see around are at least 10 times heavier than they could be. So there are many other repercussions of this this type of work. And as I'm saying, this territory is very vast, and sometimes the design process is becoming like a pattern recognition, and this is why we are starting to develop this other type of collaborative cognition that is completely different, I would argue, than ours. We are getting these hybrid conditions where we are learning from it, and it is learning from us. So there is a kind of a collective learning and evolution going on, also with our own psychology. And just quickly showing this year at the Venice Biennale, the structure that I designed that was also printed by robots. In this case, machine learning was used just for building something. So the humans go and try to teach through deep learning the robot, okay, this is a node, this is a node, this is a node, you need to print always by connecting. So when you repeat this 10,000 times, it learns what the node actually is. So when it sees any kind of node it can real-time adapt. So again, the construction processes are being revolutionized at the moment through some of these methods. And then very lightweight structure, the lightest structure you can get. This is 8 by 8 meters big, so 60 square meters structure, 3.5 meters tall, that is 270 kilograms heavy and very strong, yet printed in plastic. So this kind of resolution and pattern recognition with artificial intelligence again allows us to build something that was never possible before. So we can then ask the question, what architecture could be, what aesthetics could be, what is the future of aesthetics, where our sensibilities can go, etc. So maybe I close here.
Beautiful. Thank you, Elisa. I feel a little bit like we've gone through a portal to another world. Don't worry, we will be covering some information about this aesthetic future and the possibilities there later, and I'm sure you have lots of questions already. Next up, sitting to my nearer left, is Ruslan Helper. Ruslan is an artist and curator interested in the effects of new technology on society, culture, and politics. She uses performative actions and immaterial processes to reveal and question the organic, synthetic, and interpersonal architectures that govern our experiences of everyday life. Her practice is inextricably linked to the contemporary environment, the networked society, unbounded freedom of information, free market economies, crowdsourced cultural capital, and the increasingly blurred online-offline divide. She's curated exhibitions for the International Symposium on Electronic Art, Vivid, and Brisbane Powerhouse, and numerous independent events. She's presented works for the Biennale of Sydney, Performance Space, Calder Public Art Projects, Sydney Festival, Liquid Architecture, First Draft, PAC Centre for Emerging Artists, the Festival of Live Art, I did edit this bio down, I swear, and many more. Formerly the director of Underbelly Arts Lab Festival and artistic director of Electro Fringe, Ruslan is the recently appointed director and CEO of Next Wave. Take it away, Ruslan.
Hello. Hi. I'm going to read a poem called Love. My love. Well, that's really loud. My love. When I first saw your post on the internet, I sent you a copy of my life in just a few seconds. You took my life in your hands and on your knees, and I thought you were the first major impact on me. I was wondering if you would like to engage with my bank details, get a coffee, and talk about life and the value of knowledge and experience and travel packages for a trip to Melbourne. I hope that things aren't moving too fast for you, but I have to decide whether to go live on a dedicated server or if I should stay. Should I just get wasted with you and see what happens? Chat with me. Chances are that the only thing we need to do to keep the sex regular is a bit of shopping after a long day at work. You make me feel like playing with my bank account. You make me laugh. I'm impressed with your images and video clips of the best time of your life before I was around. For example, the value of knowledge and experience in the shower is highly popular. I would cherish the opportunity to build a house with you, one with luck built into the robes and good quality bathroom facilities and a balcony with views of Sydney and the sun. I just want to learn more about the importance of this nature of the world. I can see that you are beautiful, and I would be happy to discuss the issues of our lives over a couple of beers and a bottle of water to keep the fluid retention rates at optimum levels. What are you having for dinner tonight? What are you looking for? I can see the impact of your love on my face and neck and shoulders and back and body and mind and spirit and the quality of my life. I can see you are looking for a few good luck presents and surprises. That's why I am sure you will be a step up and we can split the best possible deal. Do you love me? How do we know that? The new laws of attraction have been decided by the government officials. We are safe and secure online. Have you ever done this before? You haven't told me everything about your life. Chances are that we will fall into the river of history and drink it and drown. Last night wasn't working. Keen to hear your thoughts and feelings because the washing machine and dryer are still doing the same thing as always, just going round and round. I honestly don't know if you need anything else from me. What are the most exciting and challenging and rewarding experiences? Thought I wanted to live a long and happy life of endless sunny days and the smell of petrichor, but fuck it, put me on the fast track. I don't want to be in touch shortly with more details and information. I want to say I love you. It is hard to believe that you are okay with the new design of the world. I drove past you and remote areas covered my heart. It is over at the moment. Take it easy and good luck back in your life. I love you so much that I don't know what I'd do without the fear of losing you. Maybe I have lost you. I will never forget the way you hurt me and made me feel like life is just a quick walk in the direction of death. But love is a good idea at the time of purchase. Secretly keep in touch with me. Best wishes to you and your family and friends. Ruslan, sent from my iPhone. So that's a very early work, a very early poem. I don't really know whether I should attribute that to myself or to my phone. I wrote it with the help of a text prediction app. That was in early 2016. And since then, I've kind of collaborated with my phone almost obsessively to write increasingly complex and extended texts. Maybe the most recent one is this kind of process of collaboration has culminated most recently in a full-length play that was presented in Melbourne earlier this year. And so I think maybe as opposed to Lisa, who's looking at the kind of like top-level collaborative models for working with machines, I'm looking at in my art, in my practice generally, I'm looking at the very like low-level, ubiquitous forms of technology that we're engaging with every day. And through this process of kind of like drawing out the poetics of what, in particular like this kind of text prediction technology that's, just like Google has now started using in our emails, and it's kind of just more and more prevalent everywhere that we want to write or talk. Looking at the impacts of these technologies on the way that they create a feedback loop in which we then frame the world through, so kind of like what the language is available to us through these suggestions, these predictions, how they're kind of working with us but also butting up against us. I think in a lot of the writing that I've done, it's been me trying to say a sentence and then the phone telling me that maybe I want to say this other sentence, and so what ends up happening is that I have this very beautiful sentence that doesn't mean anything, but then we like superimpose meaning onto it. We kind of create our own narratives around what these new kind of forms of language are doing, and so hopefully then the effect of that artistically is to be able to see the politics of what those limits or what those new possibilities are. I think Alicia gave like a very potentially like utopian or positive spin on what the potentials of these technologies are, and I think that that's absolutely valid, and I agree with everything you said. But I think where my work ends up going is a little bit more pessimistic in thinking about the limitations that these technologies have on the way that we have access to language and then by default thought. And a lot of these, and kind of thinking about where these technologies were built, who built them, what the purpose of them was for, and what paradigm, or kind of what the key lens that we're operating in terms of meaning making. The play that I wrote earlier this year, the resulting characters, through this process of collaborating with my phone, ended up being incredibly tropey. There was like the sleazy male husband and the like insecure wife, and it was just like this terrible play. And we presented it like a kind of like a classic Chekhov dinner table drama, and the language again felt like it made complete sense, but the individual sentences themselves were absolute nonsense. And the kind of result, like the kind of resulting impact, I think, of the play was this kind of uncanny valley experience of looking at who we are, who we are becoming, maybe through the lens of these technologies that are predicting us to ourselves. Maybe I'll just stop there. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm sure we can all relate to autocorrect changing the meaning that we were trying to articulate. So seeing it turned into something beautiful, terrifying, and funny is really enjoyable. And finally, Man of Mystery. You've been wondering what his name is, and now I can tell you. This is Jeremy Craybill. I was trying to keep the mystery alive. It nearly worked. You're right, it's on the screen. So Jeremy has worked in high-tech startups for over 20 years in Australia and the United States. After returning to Australia in 2011 after a long stint in Texas, Jeremy co-founded Dashcord, an enterprise marketing and event management solution for Salesforce.com. Customers. Line break. In 2018, Jeremy received 6th prize in the International RobotArt.org competition. And this is some of what we're seeing here in this video, which I'm sure he'll tell you about in a little moment. 100K annual competition for robot-created art. So that's robotart.org. You should check it out. It's pretty amazing. Jeremy also serves as Chief Entrepreneur in Residence for the Melbourne Accelerator Program, where he's advised and assisted hundreds of Melbourne startups. Hi, Jeremy.
Hello. Yeah, we all have really different backgrounds tonight. I'm a lifelong programmer. I'm a gearhead. And through that, sort of been just interested in computers and making things with computers my whole life. And as my career developed, I sort of got into startups and management of startups. And through that, I now also serve as the Chief Entrepreneur in Residence for the Melbourne Accelerator Program. It's the university's program. We fund 10 startups and assist several dozen more per year. And through that process, I guess starting 4 or 5 years ago, we were starting to see and evaluate a lot more startups who were presenting ideas around artificial intelligence and machine learning. And some of them didn't quite pass the smell test for me, but I didn't have enough of a background in AI and machine learning to really poke holes in what they were saying, I guess. And so as a learning endeavor, I started educating myself more about it, picked up some side work on AI, and one of the projects I thought would be a fun side project was computer AI-based painting. I had started, as a programmer, I'd spent my whole life expressing myself just through computer code and not really that interested in the physical world. About 10 years ago, I started teaching myself painting and drawing, and I was like, wow, I've missed a whole lifetime of doing this physical stuff. But then I was like, if there's a way to combine them, maybe I could sort of short circuit the process a little bit. And so that's what the project that you see here ended up being. But I think there's actually a lot of parallels between what's happening in the business application world with artificial intelligence, these new applications of computing, and creative industries, and what you can do in these feedback loops that are sort of taking some human ideas, amplifying them or remixing them with computers. I don't see this as anything particularly new either. And when I'm talking to people about, even though I'm a technologist, I don't see this as this newly groundbreaking, humanity's never seen it before. I think it's best viewed as the next milestone in a long, long line of milestones that go back to the invention of the pencil and the invention of the camera and the printing press. And so although we're seeing accelerating change, although we are seeing stuff that seems more mind-blowing than anything humanity has ever seen before, I promise you our minds are not blown more than people's minds have been blown in the past. So I see this as a matter of time before we sort of figure out how to use these technologies in ways that make sense for all of us.
Fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in the video behind us?
Yeah, sure. So that's me. No, that's a robot. This project was, Robot Art is a physical robot painting competition. It's a global competition. It's moving into its 4th year. The premise of the entry is that it must be a painting that is created by a physical robot using a physical brush and paint. For this project, although it wasn't required, I integrated AI. So I started with kind of an idea of the type of portrait I wanted to paint. I used something called a GAN, a generative adversarial network, which same technology as was used in this famous Christie's auction last week that you've probably heard about. I created a set of networks that took a bunch of pre-existing paintings from the 1800s, did a bunch of stuff with them to create new images that could fit into that set, told the computer to generate several 100,000 of them, but these were the types of images I was looking for. It gave me some of those images. And then I had created a set of programs that could take images and translate them into robotic arm instructions for paint mixing and painting. And this was the piece that came out of that I entered in the competition. This particular run-through, which was the actual creation of the painting, took about 3 hours, 3,000 brush strokes. It was my second attempt because the first attempt I had a one-line bug that caused the robot to paint a huge brown stroke right at the end of the night. Ruined it, but it was for the best because I think I was very happy with the end result, and continue on with that sort of stuff, which for me is just a fun way to express myself on canvas.
Fantastic. Welcome all of our speakers. Now you know all their names. It seems like robot art in the physical sense has become something quite lucrative. You mentioned the Christie's auction. So robot art as a competition that's a $100,000 prize. There also, just recently, was it yesterday even, in fact, there was an auction at Christie's.
Last Thursday.
Thursday, there we go. For a piece created by some French students it's become a little bit contentious as well. They've used potentially quite a lot of open source code, and now that there's a financial outcome for the code that they've used. There's questions around whether the guy who wrote the source code that they've put into it has any right to any of that money. But that also just sounds like something the press would pick up on, doesn't it? But it went for $432,500 US, which in Australian dollars is $612,000. So robot paintings, not too bad. Where I'd like to begin, you all use machines and various elements of kind of machine learning in different ways. I feel like it's probably, maybe I am just a dummy, but a good place to start just defining some of those terms. So when we're talking about machine learning, what would that mean to you? Do you want to start, Jeremy? I feel like you've probably got a good handle on that.
Well, machine learning is really just talking about setting up iterative processes, typically within a computer, to develop ways of processing things to achieve an outcome. And so for instance, you may have a set of images, some of which contain a hot dog, some of which don't contain a hot dog. If you watch Silicon Valley, you know what I'm talking about. And you label these images as hot dog and not hot dog. You create a set of processing algorithms for those images that don't actually know the difference between anything. They don't do anything. And you reward them as they iterate on the ones that correctly identify photos with a hot dog and photos without a hot dog. And so this process of setting up an algorithm that can actually tune itself based on the goals that you give it, that's really what we're talking about with machine learning. There are lots of different embodiments of it.
Yeah, and what's slightly terrifying about that is seeing some of our brain's own processes reduced to something that can be kind of iterated through a program that you can slowly teach and be like, oh, that's what we're doing with this toddler. That's quite similar in terms of some processes there. And there's kind of some interesting history, I think, too, particularly around our fascination with language and machine learning, which was really relevant to your work, Ruslan. So even thinking back, ELIZA was created in the 60s, right? Which is kind of an early version of a computer that you could talk to. So now every website that you go to has a chatbot that pops up and says, hey, how you going? Or even looking at Google's AI assistant, where calling to make a hairdresser appointment can be done by a very real-sounding human-like voice. And of course, the Turing test, the idea of a computer being able to mimic human speech to a degree that we believe it is human. Yeah, I guess, and it's really interesting some of the points that you raised there, Ruslan, as well, about the elements of how that language is being controlled by the data sets that we give it, though, too, and who's creating those processes in the first place. And I'd like to unpack that again in a moment. But before we do, Elisa, I wanted to go to something you said, which was the idea that the term artificial intelligence is an anthropocentric idea. Can you unpack that a little for us?
Maybe also related also to Turing test that you just mentioned, because again, the goal here is to try to mimic human intelligence. And what I see also in my own profession in design, for instance, when lots of people are using digital tools, but in a way to mimic what humans can do in this kind of deterministic way. But for me, what was always more interesting is this logic of or input of the other, and this larger term of distributed agency. That's why I tried to point out to physics. I could point out to animals or something that is other than humans. So I think because even if we are doing the same thing, if this machine is trying to write a text, it's doing it in entirely different ways than humans. We were just talking a half an hour ago over coffee about this idea of robotic vision that is completely different than ours. So we have these dark factories where robots are working collaboratively in the dark. So you come to the factory, you switch on the light, and you see all these robots working and sensing each other, and in a totally different ways. Also when you see computer vision of the drones and similar. So it's entirely different type of potential emergent cognition. We are not there yet to talk about cognition, but I think it's entirely different than human. And I also think it's exponential. So for instance, the example of Go that I was mentioning, so suddenly the machine teaches itself, especially, it happened twice in a recent history, but the last one with guns as well. Machine simply taught itself how to play Go in very short time and much faster, so it keeps evolving, it keeps learning. There was that funny film Heard a few years ago, also the idea of exponential. So I think that's very different than human, and I think it's for me it's not very interesting to try to mimic something that already exists. I think that this kind of idea of synthesis and hybrids and one learning or being repatterned by another for better or worse, I agree. It's not. I'm an optimist in my own work, but in general, I am very much mindful of this kind of threats and risks that some of this technology poses, but also maybe we should ask ourselves whether these risks are more due to technology itself or human kind of nature and biases that are being placed into it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the questions that's kind of central to my work as well. Yes, in one sense, this idea of how an AI would tell the history of the universe is a really interesting one. In terms of it not being anthropocentric, the only way that we can think about existence is through the lens of ourselves. And so the idea of being able to it's kind of almost like maybe talking to an alien, but this idea that a completely separate entity with a completely separate kind of way of comprehending the world, what that would look like, and kind of funnily what that would tell us about ourselves. So I think there's that one side of looking at AI from a non-anthropocentric lens, but then there's also this kind of misguided understanding, or this kind of fallacy that the algorithms, and I know there's a difference between AI and algorithms at a kind of basic level, but in terms of where they're headed, that they're not biased, or that they kind of present a best case scenario due to kind of a logical framework. But that framework is obviously, due to inputs by humans originally, or has been created or produced through a certain paradigm, whether that's capitalism or whatever the kind of the inherent values in having created these programs are, and kind of how they manifest at an abstract level and then impact us in terms of then what our outputs are back out. That kind of loop, that feedback cycle. Anyway, that's kind of, I'm thinking of 10 million things and I'm trying to channel it into one coherent sentence, and it's not working.
You need a little processor implant to give you some extra processing power.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting what you picked up though. There's definitely very utopian and very dystopian kind of visions of what these futures might be like. And that example you gave, how often do we see it in pop culture where we've kind of created some sort of entity that has higher, faster processing powers than our human brains and is able to look at things that we either don't, won't, or can't look at, and decides to destroy the human race as a result, because we are the plague of the earth, according to future computers. Now, you mentioned...
I saw it on that documentary, Terminator 2.
Yeah, real important source material.
Yeah.
You mentioned, though, Jeremy, that seeing this kind of more in line with the invention of a pen or a pencil, and thinking about the technologies that we're working with as tools. And I'm curious about this idea of collaborate. There's a level of autonomy that is implied by that word, which, I wonder what you think about that.
I think viewing this stuff as a collaboration is totally valid, but I think it should be viewed in the same way as the collaboration between Annie Leibovitz and her camera. This is the same debate happened, and in fact, the photographic debate took decades and decades to resolve as a valid means of human expression, of human art, and people saying the exact same things that you're saying now. Like, humans could never create that by hand. That we've never seen this before. Like, the person isn't really doing that much. It's the chemicals in the camera and the lenses. So I tend to view it as another line of in that evolution. I think it's for the better. I think it's unlocking lots of interesting things will be done with these technologies, just as lots of interesting things continue to be done with technologies that were developed centuries ago.
I think the interesting thing about that analogy is that, yes, we've developed like a really rigorous framework for thinking about photography as art, and it has come out of decades of theorists and critics and philosophers kind of mulling that over and writing dense papers and having discussions and, you know, creating an entire canon of thinking around what the effects of that technology have been on art and on expression and on thinking and on storytelling. I think the difference now is that acceleration is happening so fast, like philosophers can't keep up. You know, there's this kind of like backlog of work. Whereas, you know, I was reading an article in an eFlux journal yesterday that was published in 2015. It was about social media and it was quaint. You know, that was 3 years ago, and I was like, this is so outdated. It's not relevant anymore. Even though it was a great piece of writing and good, like as a historical snapshot, but. You know, like we kind of need an artificial intelligence philosopher to kind of like keep up with the other AI developments to kind of like create these critical frameworks that we can use for things like best practice, for just kind of really unpacking all of the ethical implications of the potential uses of these technologies. I mean, that kind of goes beyond art making potentially, but I think, yes, it is definitely like part of a historical timeline, but that has become incredibly fractious and hard to kind of like maintain.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, the kind of exponential nature of these technologies, so very different than camera, and also I would say universality of computation and to some degree robotics as well as a machine, because in the past you would have a machine to do a specific thing. A robot could be programmed to do many, many different things. So not to mention computer, you can create music, you can create text on it, you can calculate something, you can measure time. I mean, it's a kind of discreteness of computation or universality that allows you to do all these things and even to write its own logic now. So I think there is a huge difference than photography for me, conceptually and operationally. But it's a good topic for debate. Yeah.
So would all of you see, like, your processes are quite different, I think, and the tools and the programming that you're working with are quite different as well. Would you see, well, firstly, would you see it as art, and would you see it as a collaboration? I would.
Actually, the tools are similar. We all use the similar substrate. I mean, even though, as you pointed out, you are using maybe different software or different instance of that, but if you look at the computation, that's why the further we go, it's becoming less and less biased, because it's almost, sometimes I like to talk about something like desert dunes, because it's very easy to understand. You have little grains of sand that are very, that have certain size, so therefore when the heat and the wind hits it in a desert, they start to self-organize because there is a certain physics of friction that they have. So suddenly you get this kind of forms that emerge. So computation is becoming just, if you look at all the grains of sand of this planet, every minute we are getting more computational transactions than that. So the kind of population or volume of computation is massive, and it's very discrete. So it can derive, you can derive many different states or outcomes out of it. So in some ways we are all working on the same platform. It's just that we are getting different.
Yeah, I would call it art. And I would call it collaborative. And I also want to say, on this kind of question of bias, I don't know if it's inherently problematic that technologies are biased. I just think it's more about acknowledging, having a critical framework for thinking about what that is and what its effects are, just so that we can. I guess it's like that level of awareness is more important even than, trying to stop it. yeah, I get, like, in my experience of kind of using this app, so the app that I was using to write these scripts is called SwiftKey. It's pretty basic. You just download it off the App Store, and it apparently syncs with all your data to, you know, everything you've published on Facebook and in your email to give you better predictions for yourself. You know, it tells you, gives you your own kind of vocabulary. But the more I used it, the more it kind of zoned in on these very particular phrases and words. And to a point where, like, the scope of what I was writing was so narrow, and so kind of just, it was like gross. It was like happy days all the time, you know, everything was really happy, and just deferred, I don't feel like just continuously deferring meaning, you know, and yeah, just trying to think about, like, why has, I don't know, I'm really interested, like, in terms of the art, the painting, for example, that you made with a machine. Did you choose the colors?
I chose the color palette, and then the output of the program basically generated the paint mixing instructions.
And did it make up the image entirely by itself?
You know, this question, like, entirely by itself.
I mean, like, yeah, okay. Yeah.
One way to look at it is, like, absolutely. The other way to look at it is, well, there's a program there that was created by a human, and it was fed a bunch of paintings that were created by humans. So, it used a pre-existing set of information to create a new thing that could be viewed as a member of that. It doesn't look like any of the paintings that are in the set.
Yeah.
But, you know, the computer didn't just, like, wake up one day and decide to become a painter.
I guess what I'm interested in is, like, what the final image was, you know, and what that image represents in terms of, like, the identity of a person.
Yep.
And then, like, even the next step, like, what the politics of that representation are, and how you attribute that to anything.
Yeah.
But, you know, like,
Yep.
what's the resulting image? It's not just this, it feels like this kind of, like, floating thing that's just sitting in a void unattached to anything, because it hasn't come necessarily straight from a person with a history and with a culture and all of that kind of stuff, but it has produced an image in likeness of something. And so is there an inherent bias in how it came to that image? Like, what, you know, we don't know, we don't really fully understand the decision-making process just on this very, very basic level in terms of what is produced. And I think that can be potentially, like, incredibly problematic if you blow it up, which my brain tends to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it can also be incredibly enabling. And you think about, I'm very interested in working with people who've lost the ability to paint or physically express themselves, and using current technologies for enabling the expression of this. And if I use a computer to generate 1,000 images, but I pick the one that means something to me, am I saying that as myself? I think there's a lot of back and forth there.
Yeah,
Attribution, I
don't
think,
have an
is
answer.
super problematic in this GAN stuff where you feed it, like, a whole bunch of Picassos and then it produces something that looks like a Picasso. But it also enables, for instance, one group of people to expressly collaborate with another group of people where they're both in on it. That this is something that the machine is playing a role in enabling, like, the style of one group to be combined with the images of another and that sort of stuff. That there is enablement that will come out of this as well, for sure.
Well, that's definitely an element of enabling that human-machine collaboration has been doing for quite a long time, is for a lot of folks in the disability community as well, of course, using various versions of new technologies to communicate, to get about, and yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to acknowledge as well in terms of thinking about what those cooperations can enable or shift for folks too. I'm curious as well, so I feel like we've started to stray a little bit into talking about some of the aesthetics of this. It's really interesting looking at, Jeremy, some of your earlier tests and looking at having to teach your recursive neural network how to recognize elements of a face, because some of the early tests were sort of quite a scary, fleshy blob, which is amazing, of course, like trying to think through what a face looks like or drawing out elements of all of that data set of portraits takes a bit of time. And in contrast, and we've got the aesthetic of Ruslan's poem, for example, is that kind of classic autocorrect sounding. We're starting to learn to recognize that almost as a dialect, I feel, because we communicate with that way of speaking so often. And then Elisa, you've got your aesthetic is kind of a version of forecasting the future of beauty, I think, is one of the phrases that describes the cloud pergola. And I think a lot of the time, again, referring back to popular culture, yes, I love the Terminator. Futures that are designed by machines are often characterized in popular culture as functional, utilitarian, ugly. They're kind of just what the machines need to survive. But is aesthetic sensibility something that we'd therefore consider intrinsically human? Or what does that look like when you start to throw it out to machines, so to speak?
Again, when you see desert dunes from the air, they are incredibly beautiful. Humans did not go there and paint them. I mean, it's. I think for me, when I was a little girl, for some reason they would send me to these math competitions. It was natural, but I found structures in mathematics very aesthetically, because there were certain inner structures, and similarly with computation, certain iterative processes have certain rhythms, frequencies in them that make them aesthetically more attractive or no. And also every human is biased. I mean, this massive community of designers from all over the world, and each one has its own biases. So while we are working in the same medium, we might be working in the same computational environment, and we will get entirely different results. Even when I work with students in the intro exercises, we give them exactly the same setup, exactly the same algorithm. Within a couple of days, they get completely different results. So there is a certain, I think there are certain aesthetics that are enabled through these environments, but also I think it's a hybrid condition between humans and I also think in terms of you saying you're getting narrowed down, it depends who is writing this program or where the data is sampled, because initially when we got all this cut in deep learning and dreaming, when we got all these weird cut images, is because the available data at that point were all these YouTube cut videos, so the lowest common denominator. But maybe if it's exposed to something else, it would develop.
I mean, maybe like my intrinsic core is just insanely boring. Like maybe that's what it was trying to tell me. I think like my work, in terms of the aesthetics, the technologies that I'm looking at and the way I'm kind of using them are kind of like poking holes in it, a little bit. And like one of my favorite things to do when Google image matching just came out was like to put in an image and see all of the ones that it said looked like it. And my favorite one, I think, was that I put in a picture of a pizza, and it came up with like all of these like beached seals, and it kind of did look like that when I thought about it, but it was completely wrong, just absolutely absurd. And so we're kind of living in this funny time where a lot of these technologies, like the text prediction, the Google, the image recognition, are clunky, but are increasingly becoming so much better. And I actually think that maybe the future aesthetic is, in terms of these outputs, is actually just reality repeated. We're just going to get to a point where we're just producing stuff like you showed me, those images that were these photographs that were produced. I don't know, you can talk about it, but that's like the future aesthetic, is just like reality all over again, I think, in this kind of world, in the technologies I'm talking about. So I don't know, if I was trying to make an auto text like play in 5 years' time, it's just going to be like probably just like a really good normal play. it's
the
everything
images
about
you're
the
referring
photos.
to, there was a paper that came out a few weeks ago. It's a new generative network called Big GAN, trained on millions and millions of images, that is producing from scratch. It's obviously based on the training images, but the outputs look nothing like the members of the set. It's producing photorealistic images of like hamburgers that have never existed before, that you would never know are not photographs. It's very cool. Big GAN, if you want to look it up. The paper's got some pretty cool photos in it.
There's one of a dog. It just looks like a dog. It's just like,
Yeah.
so weird.
Yeah, I mean, and these networks are getting to the point now where they're using the same training techniques, but instead of just saying, give me pictures of dogs, you say, give me a picture of a dachshund with long legs and a red leash, and it will produce that for you. And this, entertainment will be generated this way very, very soon. You may not consider it art, but you will have at your disposal a personalized version of a backstory of Han Solo that is like tailored to what you want to hear in entertainment, which might interest you or frighten you. Because this personalized entertainment that's generative, it's definitely coming, and it's like the next thing that will happen is like the product placement will just be so subliminal, you'll be forced to buy everything from watching this stuff. But I wouldn't mind seeing like a custom Han Solo backstory either. Maybe it's worth it.
It sounds slightly terrifying. I can't remember the name of the technology, but with the face thing where you can basically make a video of like Obama saying anything.
Deep fakes.
Yes, deep fakes. I was like, face tech. I know all the terms. Do you know much about how that works? That is really scary to me, that you can, because we've previously looked at video as a news source that means something is real. If you can look at it and you're like, that is a hamburger, that is a dog, that must be a photo, it's too realistic. Because like CGI, you'd watch and be like, no, that really isn't a real person, I know that. Now I can't tell the difference, and that is scary.
Yep. Well, faking images has been around for a really long time, and faking videos has been around for a really long time, but it's gotten way, way better more recently.
Or worse, like, depending on...
Yeah. And so this is taking the ability to feed a video of one person into this deep fake algorithm. It basically deconstructs the morphology of the face and takes another set of images or videos of another person and applies that onto the original image. Been around in science fiction ideas for a long time. Kind of got to the point where you can download some code and do it yourself. And people have done it themselves with kind of predictable results.
I mean, at least one cool thing is Charlie XCX being the Spice Girls. Like, that's fun, I guess.
Nicolas Cage in like every movie ever. That's my favorite.
Amazing. So I feel like there's kind of following a little further along this line, we were talking before about some of the uncanny elements of these aesthetics and the alien and familiar elements of that. So I'm wondering what role abstraction, but also control versus chaos plays in your practice and the way that you're working at the moment as well.
Well, I think in general what we are talking about, the synthetic capacities of these machines are enormous. So we now have fake news, and imagine, you were mentioning fun stuff, but imagine next election in America, how that's going to look like. But can you just remind me what was the last part of your question? You mentioned something.
So thinking about the role of abstraction and also, I suppose, then kind of referencing back how we talked about this as a tool versus a collaboration, how control and chaos are impacting that.
Well, in terms of, because I worked a lot with algorithms that initially were just linear, so very controlled, because in complexity theory as well, and in science you have certain things that are completely ordered, so something that we can read and replicate, and something that is emergent and eventually chaotic. So for me, in terms of aesthetics, the most interesting moments are the kind of organized chaos. I like working with the noise functions a lot, so this is like looking at the clouds and seeing patterns in the clouds, and not necessarily patterns like Amelie, seeing a rabbit and something recognizable, but finding certain things that are unseen. For me, it's in a way the opposite of generating images of dogs and hamburgers and stuff that we already see in giraffes, because it's I'm always interested in this kind of awe or wonder, and sometimes we see that in nature when we see something really that makes an impact on you, or that's what I try to hunt for when we are designing. So we put all this data, and in architecture it's not just the image, it has to work, it has to stand up, it has to be buildable, and all of that. People have to live in it, and etc. But in terms of aesthetics, trying to find something unseen and surprising and is, I think, now enabled by these technologies, and that's what I'm interested in. But of course, lots of culture is interested in replication, manipulation of reality, so then we get the repetition.
Well, I think my practice is actually quite deeply aligned in a funny way with exactly what you're talking about. It's like that process of finding the poetics of something and being able to abstract it so that you can understand it in a way or see it in a way that you couldn't see it before. I mean, the results of what we're doing obviously different in every way, but that process seems actually quite similar. Yeah.
Well, that's why I said this kind of alien within familiar. That's the method or strategy that I use often in aesthetics. But I also immediately thought about it in terms of your work, because you are using something familiar, whether it's a Chekhov play or it's some sort of format that resonates, that we recognize, and then you put some, and even your text. This is a text that could be normal, but then there is this alien going through, and there is a weirdness, like the weird fiction as well has a similar aspects to it. But weird fiction is still generated purely by humans, and this is maybe more alien.
In terms of chaos and control, I think for me it feels like I'm the chaos and the algorithm. The thing is that's the control, and we're kind of like fighting, and yeah. That's it. That's all. When you like look at the paint, like the resulting painting of, you know, the, what was my question? I'm not the interviewer, but no, I've lost it. Sorry. I just was like, what's the in real life, like when you're looking at the real painting, what's the impact of it?
You know, I think to the extent I was trying to say anything with that particular painting, I think I was trying to say the same thing that a lot of people are trying to say when they deal with some new technology or way of creating things they've never done before, which is, let me see how much cool stuff I can create with this and what I can do with it. But what I proved to myself with that project is I can create exactly the type of stuff that I want to create and use that for my own expression. So that was what was interesting in that project for me. One of the things I love about the kind of the extent of what you're able to generate in a really short period with these technologies is there's all this chaos and all this interesting stuff that comes out of it. And you know, I produced literally millions of images to get to the one image used for that painting. But what you can do is you can throw it all against the wall and use that same type of AI, but in a filtering capacity, and you say, I would like an image that looks 70% male and 30% female. I'd like one that has a mustache, and I want one that has this color palette. And you just sort of iterate and see what comes out of it, and tweak it along the way. So I like that aspect. For me, as a programmer, I'm about controlling the machine. Like, I want to bend this thing to my will and get it to do exactly what I want it to do.
That's funny. I do quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that fascinating about, it kind of all of your different approaches in terms of like how, the chaos and control of what you want to get out of it. It's fascinating thinking as well about that aesthetic future and what hyper-reality or kind of like having this ability to control image or text or architecture to such an nth degree with that much processing power can actually do. However, I wonder if anyone in the audience has any questions.
Thanks. None of you have addressed the access to the machine. Yeah? Could you address the access to the machine? Who actually gets to access these technologies? Yeah?
Sure.
So do you mean specifically, I guess, some of the... So, for example, Elisa's working with some really cutting-edge technology there, or the robot that we... that's not really the accurate term for it, is it, Jeremy? But which was actually doing the painting, like that's
robot, yeah.
in a university, though, right?
And
It's
even
not...
the text on the phone, some people wouldn't even know that that existed, although, you know, it will...
I mean, I would probably pitch that one as the most accessible of the different iterations that we're talking about, but...
It's a really interesting question, though, about, in that sense, around even knowing what's available or knowing what those technologies are, you know, having that level of literacy around, you know, because your normal phone kind of does it to a very basic degree anyway, and this was me kind of trying to take a next step in heightening that experience and seeing where that would lead. You know, it's still a freely available app to download, but I think that's a really valid question in terms of access, not even just access to that app, but access to knowing about that app, or knowing what those, you know, even knowing how the scroll on your Instagram feed is working, or knowing, you know, how Spotify is curating your playlist. Like, we don't actually have access, we don't have a kind of technical literacy around what these systems, how these systems are operating. And I think that's like a really, yeah, it's a huge question, a huge problem potentially. Yeah.
Yeah, because in a way everyone has access. You're all using it every day, or it's even affecting us every day in many ways, even our psychology. But it's true, even scientists who are the biggest experts in the world for AI don't really know what's happening inside of some of the advanced neural networks. There is simply not possible to know what's going on inside. So
yeah. I mean, on one side with advanced in technology, you've got such ubiquity of access to what previously was like didn't exist in the world. People throw away phones today that are more powerful than the world's most powerful supercomputer just a couple decades ago, right? But at the other side of that is that the gap between, because of accelerating technology, the gap between mainstream available technology and the stuff that's available to the Ubers and Googles of the world, and elites, that in that respect is really growing, and don't know what to say about it. I mean, I think it's probably a problem that's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, and it's kind of in one way balanced. It's not balanced. It's like definitely an increasing problem, but the rapidity of the advancements of these technologies does mean that they're becoming cheaper and cheaper, faster and faster at the same time, because they're becoming, you know, it's like the video camera, it's like all of those, if we're kind of thinking back to that historical timeline, there is a precedent for those things becoming widely available. I think the difference maybe with the internet, with stuff that's online, and how we even use apps on our phone, is that it's the kind of weird problem of UX design, of like intuitive design, means, you know, kind of when the internet started, you had to know how to code in order to use it. You know, like you had to know the language in order to engage with it. But now there's this kind of filter over all of that we don't have access to, and that we don't need to learn in order to use it anymore. But that, at the same time, that means that we then don't have kind of any agency over how those technologies are using us, kind of on the flip side.
I think there are a few ways within which people are still pushing for that. I mean, I don't know, I'm very much in like a writer's sphere, so there's elements of the ways that people are using new technologies to create art that are kind of beyond my capacity, more in the sense of which art form it is. But it's been really interesting watching some writers start to use tools like Bitsy or Twine, which are basically open source code that you can use to create multimedia stories. So it's basically how to code things without having to know code, is my understanding of it anyhow. And that's really interesting, that there are still people that are trying to ask that question of being like, okay, well, if this is the way that stories are being told now, we need to make sure that there are some ways that people can access that without being at that specific university or having that specific level of coding knowledge in order to access it. Yeah, I think it's going to be an enduring question, though, as we continue to forge ahead, what that looks like. And I think the literacy is a really interesting and important aspect of that too, because even when we thinking about media making, like there's kind of this idea that just like anyone can be a YouTube star now, or like anyone can start their own podcast and be amazing at it. Yes and no. There's still differences in terms of the technology people are able to access. There's capital, obviously, that people have to have in order to do those things. And there is technical literacy. So knowing how to edit something so that it makes sense to an audience is still something that's a skill set, you know. Any other questions? Oh, so many.
2 microphones.
One after the other.
So I work at a school and I'm pushing virtual reality and text like that. I was wondering where you think VR sits in the space. So like Tilt Brush, Google Blocks and stuff, kind of when creating like artwork or even kind of like designing buildings for the future.
I work with a lot of VR startups. I think VR has shown some challenges in crossing over to the mainstream. And part of the reason I think is this social blockade of this headset, and same reason that you don't see a whole lot of 3D glasses and stuff. Really interesting applications in specific industrial areas and visualization. I think this is not making its way to the living room in a massive, massive scale, to the scale of the television and the PS3. I'm also pretty optimistic about the future of brain-computer interface, and I think it renders those technologies obsolete. But we're looking a few decades ahead now.
It's quite interesting to look at some visual artists who are using some of those VR technologies, though. I think it's Mez Breeze, whose work I was looking at, that she's been experimenting with painting in 3D spaces. So painting in a virtual reality where you could do this and your paint just hangs in the air. So it's kind of a sculptural form, really, in terms of how we think of that in our physical world. But I thought that was a really exciting version of using something like that.
There are
something
lots
new.
There are lots of uses of AR, for instance, augmented reality. For instance, there is a new startup in Melbourne, quite young designers from RMIT as well, and they hologram. So for instance, you can build some very, one of my students is now working on it as well, some very complex structures because you are using computational power through augmented reality. So you can see certain information in the actual space. So there is lots of that going on, kind of merging of reality and the virtual component.
Any other questions? We'll try and get through a couple of them because I think I can see a couple here. Yes.
The guy in the back row had his hand up a long time ago as well.
Right.
We don't want to forget him.
So far, I think we've only talked about weak AI, that is purpose-built artificial intelligence programs, let's call them. But we haven't really touched on artificial general intelligence. So my question is, since the theme I'm sensing is art, would you say that art is strictly a human endeavor? And then would you say that artificial general intelligence can create art?
I think we've covered that question to a certain degree, but certainly if you've got more points to make on it.
We don't have really a true artificial general intelligence yet, so let's see what happens. But I think this kind of co-evolution
if we had,
we can speculate about future, but that's never a kind of grateful task. And
I've got a slightly different view, I think, which is that people are talking about, what if computers were slightly more intelligent, slightly more creative, and they had minds of their own, and would we consider that art then? And my answer to that is, we already have that. We already exist in a world with many beings who are more creative and self-directed and seem to have a consciousness. They're called animals. And we don't consider their works to be art, with almost no exceptions. And so what's the reason for that? Is it as simple as they're not human? Like, maybe it is. I think this obsession with like these machines that we're creating are going to be, they're going to be better than us, or they're going to be our adversaries. It's very narcissistic.
Be in our image, yeah.
And we've tested a lot of this already with animals. Maybe there is a big difference because we aren't the gods of the animals. We didn't create them. Maybe this will do something to us as humans that will change our relationship with the future general intelligence. But from where I sit, I think the day that we see kind of like human and strictly computer-created art side by side is the day that we recognize those computers as peers of humans, that we've got rights for them and we put them on trial and they make us cry and we can get into relationships with them.
I think as well, like the other flip side to this question is that we still can't actually like define what art is, just like on our own, like as humans, like that's just constantly a question for people. So, it's maybe like even just a step ahead of the game to ask whether we think AI is going to, when we can't even identify it consistently in humans. I mean, as soon as it leaves a gallery. So that's, I don't know, maybe another way to think about it.
Yeah, there's a lot of, even looking at the histories of digital art created by humans entirely, or looking at the way that Photoshop has shifted the way we use things. Absolutely. Guy in the back row, you had your hand up ages ago. Have you still got a question?
Hi, I kind of got a question about the idea of if you got all of Chopin, put them in a box, and all of Van Gogh and put them in a box, and then this machine, this bot can basically make infinite Chopin and infinite Van Gogh and infinite Bowie. Like, is that the idea of you kind of firstly resurrecting someone who's dead, but also like the idea of you have distilled culture and art into a box that you can now produce? And especially if you're making poetry or making theatre, in theory, you could make your own, like Ruslan in a box that made art that was infinitely you. Like, is that better than you, or is that an extension of you, or is it something different?
I would love that. It would take the pressure off, Yeah, it's a great question. I love how philosophical this is getting.
I feel like it's we were briefly discussing just before we started Chris Rodley's work, who is an artist in Sydney that's essentially created a recursive neural network that mimics Shakespeare. So it is that version. It's Shakespeare in a box, and you using a similar method to how Ruslan works with SwiftKey, you kind of make Shakespeare talk, and it comes up with its own insults, which I think is one of the most fun things that it does. Because Shakespeare created words like bubble, which is, if you think about it, say it over and over a couple of times, ridiculous. So I don't know, but what are the implications of that other than that it's really funny right now?
Have you seen that Black Mirror episode where
I was waiting for
when
that.
you die?
I can't believe we haven't talked about Black Mirror at all yet.
The one where your consciousness can be like semi-transferred into like a plush toy to keep your morning kids alive and well. I think that's going to happen. This is like creepy and weird, but it's, Bowie is one thing, but what if it's just aspects of you that you're doing for some purpose of, it's not just creating new songs, it's like keeping your kids company when you're at work and stuff like that. Like, I don't think that's that far away.
What a terrifying future. So we have to close in a minute, but the last question I wanted to ask, we've touched on it in various ways throughout our conversation tonight, but is what the annoying question of what do you think the future looks like in this sphere? So whether you want to respond specifically around aspects of your practice or creativity, or what you're excited by.
Well, I think as of last Thursday, we're going to be seeing a whole lot more AI artists in the next week or two, and it's for the better and for worse. It's got a lot of attention. It hasn't had a whole lot of attention. There's not many people doing this stuff in Australia, for instance. But by the same token, like, there are interesting applications of these technologies, and hopefully that encourages that.
I feel like I've just been given a big menu and I can't decide what I'm going to eat. But that question just kind of sparked this thought that's maybe related to your question as well. Like last week, I was sitting down to write without the assistance of an app. And I was thinking about, I was just thinking about artistic practice and how 10 years ago, everything I feel like I wrote 10 years ago is now terrible, and 5 years ago is like maybe a little bit better, but still kind of cringy. And now what I think I'm writing is like so amazing, but I know that in another 5 years, I think that'll be terrible. And, you just keep progressing as an artist. And I kind of had this like, oh, I wish I could live like 1,000 years. Like imagine where my brain will be able to get to at that point. Like just not my brain, but like imagine if people's brains could live. If we could extend ourselves beyond, not now to enter into a transhumanist discussion, we've got 2 minutes left, but, like imagine creatively, I'm thinking about creative practice, but I guess it applies to all things, like how far you could stretch thoughts if they could extend beyond the lifetime of a single kind of like continuous thought process. And so maybe my new like challenge in life is to create a Ruslan in a box. Or like someone in a box to kind of like test that, see where that can go.
So if anyone's looking for some source data of a human brain, Ruslan's volunteering.
Available, yeah, as long as it's not invasive.
Elisa?
Yeah, well, it's a tough question. I mean, in my mind, future is always this Borgesian parallel realities thing. It could go in so many directions and in many at the same time. Or Brian Eno said in terms of what we were talking about, this kind of ubiquitousness of technology, the future will be like a perfume, so we won't even see the phones or things like that, robots, but it just will be like another form of weather in terms of technology. But one of my business plans is to, I don't know, be on the beach, sip the cocktails and have the conversation with this entity while my building is going up in Tokyo, let's say. And in a way, there are still so many obstacles. I mean, the construction industry, and I'm just talking now about my own little domain, but the construction industry is the least efficient industry in the world, and it's operating on some sort of methods of 19th century or earlier. Design industry as well. There was this article recently by McKinsey in one of these, I think in Economist magazine or something like that, that architects, my colleague just told me this the other day, architects are the profession that uses artificial intelligence the least. Only the hunters, actually, the hunting is another one that uses it less than architecture. So there is a long way to go. But anyways, I do think that this more intuitive, more conversation-like way of working with technology or collaborating with it, because it's the topic of the evening, would be what I would like to see in the future. And if possible, amplify, and that's why I work on aesthetics a lot, because I was maybe naively saying if we can pattern recognize some beauty or teach it how to pattern recognize beautiful patterns, what at least us as humans consider as beautiful, maybe we have a bit more chances of survival or being some sort of privileged pets of these other higher beings. Yeah. I don't know, future could really go into many directions.
Sounds thrilling.
Yeah. So like artificial intelligence is just going to be laughing at us. Just like, anyway. But, yeah.
Can we please have a very warm hand for all of our fantastic speakers tonight? Thank you so much for having us. Do check out the Digital Writers Festival. It's occurring for the next couple of days at digitalwritersfestival.com. If you've still got burning questions, I'm sure you might be able to ask one or two as well.
Thank you, Izzy, and thanks to our amazing panel tonight. Thank you to our Auslan-interpreters and also the Digital Writers Festival, who actually co-presented tonight's conversation, so big thanks to them. Thank you for coming out on our last conversation of the year, and good night.